Ouija boards are funny things. They're part of China's ancient history until one day, someone realized, maybe trying to contact the spirits of the dead might be a bad idea. Then centuries later, someone decides to market it as a toy to children. Which is exactly the plot to Yugioh.
This video is going to be longer than I intend each of these videos to be, and that has to do with how I'm addressing 4Kids. Yeah, I finally have to get into them, their practices, and why I will be doing this all onwards with subtitled versions of the series. Because the 4Kids and 4K Media Dubs, both subsidiaries of 4 Licensing Corporation, which I will just refer to universally as 4K for simplicity, are just so divergent from the truths of the series, and hinder it more than advance it. If you have solely watched the 4K releases, you only got about half the story due to their blatant, unnecessary omissions and alterations.
And that's because they excised most of each character's individual story arc in favor of making jokes and antagonistic banter.
A common critique is Yu-Gi-Oh! Series lack character development, but that's because of what 4K did to it. They think that's too sophisticated for the children of their intended demographic. And that's the most significant damnation about them. They dumb down everything they touch. To the point there are people out there who make entire analysis videos on just small aspects of how what they changed harmed their product.
If you made a novel and then found out that your mythology had been changed, your references have been changed, your character names have been changed, a character's personality had been changed, well, I'm guessing you would not be happy with that version of your work, and that is what the standard operating procedure for 4K was in the name of appealing to Western audiences by specifically targeting the lowest common denominators, small children, in exclusion to all others, even though the content they imported was often not originally intended for that low an age bracket, and those in that age bracket they treat as complete and utter drooling morons.
I've already discussed them a few times now and how their conduct has hurt and ostracized those who may have enjoyed content they provided. Their dub of Ultraman Tiga, an entry in a franchise that revived it from cancellation by its popular reception, was seen as one of the worst and most offensive things they ever chose to finance, solely because of how they bastardized it. Their conduct and disdain towards Kamen or Dragon Knight, a series considered better than the show was adapted from, caused that show to be shunned in its primary market and showed more respect by the station it aired on than the proprietors of the programming block it was one part of. They hated an Emmy award-winning series!
One really only needs to look at their dub of One Piece to see how bad they can get, instigating whole numbers of unnecessary plot holes and playing revisionist history with its events that they had absolutely no idea the context and relevance of when they wiped it away, to see how absolutely harmful their brand of revisionist localization is, and anything even trying to mimic them should be shunned.
To create something that a Western audience understands and sounds good is the aim of dubbing, but it doesn't necessarily make it a good dub if the divergences in the localization are not reflective of what was originally said. Changes can be made, but they should endeavor to retain as much as they can. Subtitles can be, professionals say they should be, and it's often preferred they actually be one-to-one, with little to no divergences, because they don't need to be spoken, and allows for the most retention of the original intended context and subtext which inform and build a greater picture of the story being told.
The best dubs succeed in retaining all of that, but the most a dub should alter is the phrasing of statements so such makes the most sense in our language.
Yup, you're not pretty! It's Japanese!
As you can't always speak a direct translation and have it sound right, as not all of the context will click due to structural differences, which need to be accounted for more when spoken. But in a literal text translation can be retained just fine, as words, phrases, and idioms that don't translate but have relevance to the story can be explained in annotation if there's no equivalency.
But changing facts and characters entirely from what they are supposed to be is not localization. Hell, it's not even translation. It is, for anyone importing anything, the definition of being unprofessional. And it is the single biggest criticism of not only 4K, but also certain fan and professional translators that think they can change things to whatever they want as it's synonymous with another term or expression, not realizing that the language choices are specific and intentionally chosen, or the terms they swap out and replace with them aren't actually synonymous.
And more than any other property they got their hands on, has the Yugioh franchise been their plaything and victim, with entire lists chronicling every single change that hurt the franchise, which continues to this day with Arc V and Dark Side of Dimensions dubs.
How bad is it? There's an unofficial agreement between fansubbers and anime producers and distributors about fansubbing. They tolerate it as long as it's non-profit, and they're doing it to promote the material, in the understanding that if such a series gets licensed and distributed, dub or no, that the fansubs go down. However, pretty much every company that had something licensed by 4K has waived that rule due to how defamatory 4K dubs were. They were that pissed off by them.
Yes, before Crunchyroll got the sub versions of the series, Studio Gallop would rather have you pirate any entry than have you give 4K any form of support, and that continues to this day.
This all climaxed in the late 2000s with the dub of 5Ds. The propensity for media streaming by that point permitting more people than ever to learn how it was being fucked up, and a boycott of 4K's programming blocks went into effect, which tanked their earnings, which only compounded the lawsuit.
See, 4K committed straight-up criminal fraud, trying to resell DVD distribution rights of Yu-Gi-Oh! Despite having suspended them for years, alongside making other merchandise deals that gave solely them royalties, all of which against established agreements and contracts made about the property that 4K was in full violation of. TV Tokyo and Studio Gallop took them to court over this, and immediately yanked their licenses, beginning to shop around anyone else to do the dub of Zell.
However, 4K pulled a con, skipping massive chunks of 5D's fourth arc and the final one entirely, which completely and utterly trashed appreciation of anything past the Darksiders arc for dub-only viewers, and officially licensed Zell. Zero work had gone into it aside from a piece of paper, as Zell was receiving a test dub from another company starring Johnny Young Bosch as Yuma Tsukumo.
I told you to stay away. I want a duel! I don't believe for a second you like hanging out with those losers! How do you know what I like?
But this allowed them to submit a restraining against Studio Gallop and TV Tokyo, asserting their rights over Yu-Gi-Oh! Despite it being their franchise, and the judge in the case, Shelley Chapman, upheld 4K's rights to it, as apparently international legal documentation revoking those rights had not been fulfilled to American standards, despite 4Kids clearly being the ones who had broken the contract. Thus those documents were merely a formality, and issued a court order permanently stripping any control over the franchise in US markets. In retaliation, the dub got magnitudes worse.
This lawsuit is what led to 4Kids' declaration of bankruptcy and restructuring as 4K Media and for licensing. But their model of dubbing was so self-sabotaging that they had been hemorrhaging money for years before that. The only reason they didn't go completely under was due to American bankruptcy law and buyouts from other companies for their material nullifying their outstanding debt.
But last year, despite being downsized to a company whose total workforce is 16 people, they filed for bankruptcy again, as their annual earnings, less than $4 million, is far below their operating costs. No need for a lawsuit this time. They're seriously doing that badly because the products they produce are utter shit.
But they have nonetheless continued to be an exemplar of everything wrong about importation of foreign media, with how they change the facts and characters of a series entirely from what they're supposed to be.
And I don't just mean the pre-existing series they brought over to dub. They used to have subsidiaries, such as Summit Media, which was responsible for producing...
Get them!
Oh no! He's gonna blast President Lincoln!
I knew you'd risk yourself for Mr. Lincoln.
Yes, even before importing anime was popular, they were fucking shit up for everyone.
And with anime importation and dubbing pretty much strangled into a bottleneck, this conduct is all the more unjustifiable, and baffling this serpent managed to survive having its head severed, only to grow a whole new body from its remains.
I know that seems like a lot of hyperbole, but this is still just a condensed version of how awful 4K is. I mean, when HK subs are more accurate to the underlying show in terms of story and character, you know they fucked up. Hell, the various Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged series do a better job in comparison of relating the core story, as at least they're intended to be parodies from the beginning, and are making fun of 4K's idiocy along the way, as opposed to trying to justify how awful they are as being a gag dub. I don't respect them. I don't dignify their work.
And I refuse to support them monetarily, then, now, and in the future, for how against I am what they stood for as an anime and foreign media fan, let alone someone who enjoyed this franchise, only to learn how much better it was than what we had gotten. Had they ever decided to release DVDs with the uncut, unedited, and properly subtitled content with the original tracks and everything, that at the very least would show they respected the truth of the series they imported. But they didn't, choosing to hide evidence of their lies and deceptions.
Now, to be clear, I don't have anything against any of the actors who performed in any of the dubs. Hell, I think Eric Stewart is awesome and will always be Gowri Gabriev to me, and I have other glowing words for many of the other actors that got worked through this dub, so this is not an assault on them. I'll even admit to liking some of the dub original music, just not in comparison to the original scoring. My position is of a loathing of this kind of pandering, talk down to your audience as if they were morons, form of entertainment which 4K champions. That of a seeker of truth through the lies of their alterations, and awareness of the series being better than what the majority were allowed to see.
And no other character in the first Studio Gallop anime represents how extreme the divergences from their canon characterization can be than Seto Kaiba. As in the first episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist, we are introduced to him as he is reading Friedrich Nietzsche's Also Sprach Zarathustra.
Nietzsche's philosophy revolves around an individual, through great hardship, overcoming adversity and using such to propel them into becoming a better, more complete person, in part by remaining adverse to fleeting whims and false ideals, him specifically citing abstracts like blind faith and religion. Who does that sound like to you?
Yes, this single moment informs Seto Kaiba's entire persona and character arc that is not consistent in any way with Dub Kaiba. For on top of this, Seto has expanded that to include false kindness and friendship, as he is unable to distinguish between real ones and fleeting or malicious ones due to his past experiences, which he views will only hold him back from the future he desires. This also informing the Toei Season 0 and pre-Duelist manga takes on the character. And Kaiba himself is reflective of a protagonist in Nietzsche's writings with his mannerisms, drive to obtain what he wishes with nothing seen as an obstacle, as he'll just work harder to achieve that goal, and flair for the dramatic. So the rivalry that erupts between him and Yugi isn't about card games or his injured pride, it's about ideals and what can push someone to become better and more than what they were.
And Kaiba also breaking free from the limitations of this to no longer see what could be weaknesses in others to be such, as he is proven wrong and must reevaluate himself. Not to cast off his own beliefs, but perceive more of the world and how it all fits together. How the strengths and weaknesses of others contrast each other to make people better. That is the character arc Seto is on in this series, a softening of the face he shows due to the hardships in his life.
In fact, once you're informed of that single aspect of his character, a lot of other things instantly are informed as well. Atem's initial penalty game Mind Crush, destroying the evils in himself, just doing for Seto what he was already in the process of doing himself. And Seto is unable to thank Yugi for doing that, because it's what he was working to do on his own. The initial fixation on the Blue Eyes White Dragon in the Moto's possession notwithstanding. But just having this cleansing of self given to him is against his entire philosophy of earning what you gain through the effort you put in, with that driving you through to your future. And his obsession with beating Yugi and Atem, what is driving Seto to challenge him again and again, is him seeking this validation of self against someone of an opposing perspective, to prove this core ideology he has lived by is not wrong. And this is something that the series follows through with not only to its end, but even into dark-sided dimensions where Seto's ultimate goal in that film is to obtain closure with Atem, as there were words between them that had been left unsaid.
Most of that was scrubbed from the dub, sometimes literally, with 4Kid's visual footage edits, if not otherwise misinformed entirely to make him far more of an unrepentant asshole obsessed with nursing his bruised ego and pride, even though pride was supposed to be Atem's character flaw. And then they gave him a hatred and disbelief in magic, even if it was right in freaking front of him.
Yeah, Seto knew and accepted magic existed in the manga and Japanese dub. That repeatedly lampshaded lie, replacing a refusal to let one's past define them, and fate control the obtainment of the future one desires, alongside his emphasis of hard work achieving such. All the more negligent as Seto Kaiba is the one that is responsible for building the future in the Yugioh franchise. In story for GX and 5Ds, Kaiba Corp is essential to the technological and sociological revolutions that help form the backbone for their stories, which Zal and Arc V and onwards build on. Yugi may be the key in this shift to everything becoming decided by card games over brutality and war, but Seto made it happen while Yugi himself faded into legend.
Now, expand that discourse in arc and development to every character.
あの時の俺の姿、心の闇に取り憑かれた俺自身。
Every character.
お前がどう思っているかは知らないが、俺は友達がデュエルに負けたのに気づいてやれなかった。負けりゃ悔しいし、辛くもなる。友達がそんな思いしてたのに、俺はまるで気づかなかった。そんな自分にムカついてるのさ。
Every character.
はまやかしの運命に翻弄され、行き場を失っていた俺を目覚めさせてくれた。心の全てをかけて願う。真に愛する者、お前を救いたい。お前と共に果てるのならば悔いはない。あらゆる手を使ってでも俺の魂が燃え尽きるまで。黒召喚、我が魂、レッドデーモンズドラゴン。俺の魂が持っていけ。レッドデーモンズドラゴン。俺の思いはお前に託す。
Every character. And I don't just mean this show or just the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise. Every 4K dub or adaptation experiences this exact same thing. No matter how much the real character they actually retain, by the alterations a lot more is omitted and misinforms them. You're not supposed to do this when importing a series! Damn it, Saban!
Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist begins where the Toei anime left off in its adaptation, quickly condensing Death T into one episode, and kicking off the introduction of Pegasus J. Crawford, the head of Industrial Illusions, which is the creator and proprietor of Duel Monsters, the in-series card game that everyone comes to care about due to it being more mass marketable than every other game the prior series presented, and it being an easy way to tie all the crazy magic crap that happens in this universe together. Pegasus humiliates a Tem in a Time Shadow game, stealing Sugoroku's soul as a result of the penalty game imposed, in order to entice Yugi to come to his grand tournament, Duelist Kingdom. Upon taking Sugoroku's soul, it's shown to be sealed in a card, which ends up tying deeply into the series' lore about the relation of the magic underlying everything, its various monsters, and the card game everything is inevitably expressed as.
Yu-Gi-Oh! Over time introduces the concept of dual spirits, spiritual exemplifications of the monsters and things relating to their lore. Some people find that ridiculous, others, well, the truth of them all is they're merely representations of things that exist in this realm, past, present, or future.
Some, as the Millennium Arc shows, are expressions of one's soul. Others are representative of actual individuals. Still more are simply influenced into existence upon interaction with stimuli outside of their norms, meaning they represent a possibility or the manifestation of an idea or concept, all holding the commonality of being sealed into a given form, and the cards a simpler to use means of creating and using such connections and calling upon the magic underlying the universe than the stone slabs of old. The dual spirits of that card, be it humanoid, a great beast, or something mechanical, is simply a reflection of its crystallized concept, and sometimes those who that concept reflected get carried along for the ride once dying themselves.
Though that's all because the universe was created by a divine dragon that was lonely, so used its power to create everything before sealing itself away until it had someone to play with. I'm not kidding, look it up.
So, yeah, to win back his grandfather's soul, Yugi heads off to Duelist Kingdom to face other players of the game, all to get him to Pegasus. Complicating things is Jonochi, whose sister Shizuku is going blind, and the 3 million yen prize, worth 30 grand for those who followed the anime that wonder why Joey never acted as if he was filthy stinking rich, can allow her to retain her sight. Yugi's emergency win condition is lost to the seas, all while Pegasus's machinations brings the Kaiba brothers back into play as he attempts to buy out the Kaiba Corporation. He kidnaps Mokuba for a card Seto entrusted to him, holding valuable encoded data, which would just let Pegasus steal what he wanted instead of bargaining with the board, while Seto withdraws into himself to reconsider his own life's views, only to be pulled out of his funk upon realizing the danger Mokuba has found himself in, that he let his brother fall into, and wanting to save him reawakens the heart buried under cruel hardship. Something else much less emphasized in the dub.
Shut up, Mokuba.
Incidentally, about 80 to 90% of Yu-Gi-Oh! Bridge jokes end up being things that solely mock the dub. It's weird, but appropriate they ended up that precisely targeted.
And all the while, Bakura is reintroduced and waits in the background for his time to strike. Made prominent in this arc to complement the focus permanently shifting to the card game is the Solid Vision Duel system, which reads the cards for players and creates holograms of them. The system, as presented both here and after the system is condensed down into the dual discs, contains programming which reads and checks the validity of cards, attacks, and effects used against a database in order to reduce and nullify the chance of someone cheating and remove the need for an overseeing judge, with those that aren't legal plays either not read by the system or rejected outright and the players taking penalties.
As showcased by the duel with the Puppeteer of the Dead, and later presented again in both the subsequent manga and anime continuities, this system can be hacked to disable functions. The first GX manga chapter, for example, featured a duelist who has a means of causing the system to not read the activation of a spell card and render all uses of spell cards as an illegal move. And in Universe, the actions players take have to be read by the system to be considered as a legal play in the game when using such equipment.
How it does is presumably microchips or a visual reader system built into the cards, especially with the cybernetic effects that flash across the reader boards throughout the series, signifying the various cards being acknowledged by the system.
Which is not out of the realm of possibility, as that technology has seen utilization in Japan since the mid-90s when the manga started. Hell, Bandai has a monopoly on that type of reader technology with its collectibles for a long time. Most credit cards have RFID chips as part of security measures due to encryption they provide. Even the dual-terminal arcade machines first released in the 2000s use visual reader technology not so different than what is seen in the series, showing it's something we already have, but it's just expensive to implement an actual virtual interface or add such into all the cards.
Recurring characters introduced this arc include Insector Haga, a wormy twerp who cheats inside and outside of the game to prove his intellectual superiority over his opponents, baiting them to his traps and specializing in deception. Ryuzaki, a direct and simple dinosaur specialist. Mai Kujaku, a seductive, manipulative, but lonely woman conniving to get ahead on her own, and tournaments like these being a shortcut to the success she's lacked in life. Kujaku translates as Peacock, explaining her preference for winged beast monsters, and her harpy ladies in particular would prove themselves to be one of the most popular, enduring thematic archetypes from the early days. Ryota Kajiki, a fisherman by trade looking to overcome his fear of the sea, which took from him his father in youth. Bandit Keith Howard, a former champion humiliated by Pegasus who now seeks any means to gaining an advantage over his opponents, all in the sake of revenge. The Labyrinth Brothers, fan-favorite characters who first introduced the world to the tag duel, and a system of playing the game on a map that was sadly never implemented despite fans' desire for such a system to appear. At least outside of the game Duelist of the Roses, that was pretty bad. And of course, Pegasus himself. Pegasus always amuses me when I watch him in this form, as the thing about his portrayal here, with his exaggerations of Japanese and the sprinkling in of English phrases into his speech, is it's all intentional. He's an American, most of the rest of the cast is Japanese. These eccentricities in his speech are because he's a non-native speaker using the language. Of course, he's going to sound like he's not used to saying things in Japanese. He's not actually used to saying things in Japanese. He's also presented here far more as just a businessman with sinister goals with his manipulations, and not as much outright unforgivably evil as the dub took him. Hell, he's only the villain because of the way he gets the main cast involved, but I'll get more into him next time.
The thing about the early series, though, and one of the reasons it and the game caught on so much with fans, is the early arc of Duelist pretty much serves as an extended, story-driven tutorial for various game mechanics.
The Kaiba vs. Yugi duel introduced the game and its battle mechanics. It and the first Pegasus duel are more about win conditions through life point loss, time duels, and special win conditions. Versus in Sector Haga and Mai Kujaku are accumulating card effects. Haga to bring out stronger monsters, Mai's to reinforce a small number. Mako's duel is about field effects, Fake Kaiba about traps and debilitating effects, versus Yami Bakura showcased how one can use the graveyard to recycle spent resources.
A gameplay mechanic that in hindsight would become one of the most abused in the entire game, and this is someone who runs Synchrons in the Eyes Dragons. Well, the list goes on for each element of the game that each received focus bit by bit, making the games more complex.
And the interim of all this focusing on developing characters, so while the game advertisement is a big element of all the incarnations, we're invested in them because, like any good series, we become interested in the characters. The music in the original version of the series did a lot better job in accenting these character scenes than the 4Kids one. Somber when the characters are having a tearful moment, speeding up the pace of intense battle, malicious when one character or another is in danger.
Other series with merchandising lines, especially if they revolved around a collectible game, did not do this at the time. Digimon Tamers, while using cards as power-ups, never had the cast play the card game. The original Kaijudo Duel Master series dropped players in deep into the game with no framework to how it would or could work. The Mega Man Battle Network anime never showed itself conforming to the rules of the game's battle system. Even later on with the 4Kids produced series Chaotix, they didn't do this, and that game suffered as a result. However, Yugioh influenced other companies, in a way, into doing that with their tie-in series. To mixed success that ended up hinging on how good the stories of those shows were.
At the very least, it made such a lot more subtle than American television would be with this, where they'd introduce something into a show that would inevitably scream, "Buy our toys!" at the top of its lungs. Granted, when you compare the original arc of the series against the real-life card game, you find a lot of them don't work like they did in the anime or original manga, which creates a lot of ridiculously silly moments, such as, say, a monster attacking the moon. I'd say its hem mostly won through Deus Ex Machina, but a lot of his opponent's strategies relied on that too back then.
Let me just take a look at my cards here and, Oh god, what do I do? What's the matter, Pharaoh? You act like you've never played this game before.
That, however, was mainly due to teething troubles of the medium. While Kazuki Takahashi admits he based Duel Monsters on Magic the Gathering, a lot of the time the cards, effects, and ways the game was played in the early days acted more like this was all made part of a tabletop RPG, where you're supposed to pull this kind of ass-pull bullshit, only lacking the dice roll for the save check.
Shown most commonly with cards that had no effects being used as if they did possess effects. Compounded by the fact that Takahashi originally did not start out this focus on making his own merchandise-lined card game, was them originally taking the game to Bandai, where they recreated the cards somewhat, but not in a way that permitted an easy play of the game, which has multiple times been a problem with Bandai's many card games. This would eventually result in the game's retool when they reached the Battle City arc, which came just around the time the anime was first making the rounds, with Konami, who received the game next, then matching the retooled version. The in-universe reason being differing, revised rule sets, taking more advantage of game design elements which weren't being fully utilized, such as level restrictions and actually pinning down proper effects.
Or in layman's terms, they eroded the game when they made a real card game out of it. A lot of effects Konami saw as too powerful in their original incarnation, so that when they were finally turned into real cards, their effects got nerfed. Ergo, what were eventually dubbed anime effects versus the real game's effects. I know this seems obvious, but I've run into people who don't understand this concept.
This played havoc with a lot of the things that seemed as such enormous challenges to overcome early on, but these days especially seem like such a ridiculous waste of resources. Haga's deck especially, in any incarnation he played, would have been utterly destroyed at any point in the metagame if he tried to use any of his strategies, in part once more explaining why he only ever seemed to have an advantage by cheating, because he was legitimately that pathetic.
I had freaking Mushroom Man in my deck when I beat you. You were beaten by a person who chose to put Mushroom Man in their deck.
In hindsight, it kind of weakens the effect of having the story teach people about the game if many of the ways they implemented the rules were not how they were being showcased in the show, and wouldn't be for a full year yet. It makes much of the Pegasus story arc be weaker as a result.
What I think mostly screwed people over, though, beyond the effects and monster abilities that didn't actually work that way, was the field power bonus system used for much of Duelist Kingdom.
As it worked off percentages instead of a flat increase, and in the dub of the series, they didn't even tell you it was a percentage. So for English watchers, it took us until they stopped using that system to even figure out how to calculate it. Why? Because they substituted the lines explaining that for barbs and insults in the uncut version of the episodes explaining it, and in the broadcast version, stripped it all down to a montage.
Hell, for 4Kid's intended age demographics, they wouldn't have even been taught percentages yet. That's kind of a big flag in how you're marketing a product to people it was not originally intended for.
Though, ironically, the most notorious moment of screwing the rules the series had, Atem launching an attack-enhanced Gaia the Dragon Champion to defeat the player killer by destroying the Castle of Dark Illusion, yeah, that one actually works due to game mechanics of effect damage. The effect of Catapult Turtle tributing Gaia the Dragon Champion would do enough effect damage to cause Player Killer to lose his life points and completely bypass his defense strategy. But from a narrative perspective, for a long time effect damage was seen as a very cheap way to defeat the opposing player. So the protagonist using such a strategy, it was ultimately something not seen until GX. Though, speaking of, the player killer duel really is a lot better in the subs, as the dub drowned out the entire mind game of Atem's strategy against him, this game being the return of the spirit manipulating his opponents into his traps as a way to punish them for their sins. Most games previously had him unfairly put at a disadvantage, but it's throughout the entire duel this time that he's in control. After all, it's hard to use darkness against a spirit who's drowned in it and survived. But what remained the strength of this arc was the character and personalities of the cast all being put into play. Sure, Honda was pretty much demoted by this point into the series' fifth wheel, since it was rare he actually did anything aside from share the cheerleader stand with Anzu. But even then, he seemed as if he was actually contributing more to the events. Anzu, likewise, wasn't just a lovesick cheer and friendship speech, she was actually the one snarking at everything, which 4Kids then scrubbed away. Jonouchi's arc was one of the more compelling ones regularly touched on, and affected by his playability. As the thing about Jonouchi, and this is true throughout the entire series, is he's an amateur playing among experts, in a way making him the audience surrogate in all of this in that he's not nailed down his own strategies, and in turn doesn't have the best cards, so as to think on the fly like a new player would. The dub changed him into being a lot more of an imbecile, which muted the actual excitement of him being the underdog endeavoring through all of it to find his own path to victory, whereas more experienced players already know all of the strategies made capable from their cards. He has to be clever to not only figure out his opponent's eccentricities, as almost all of his duels feature his opponents having a trick to either their tactics or how they present themselves, and with his far more restrictive resources. Even after he manages to win his ace card, the Red Eyes Black Dragon, reflective of the infinite potential he can achieve, due to gaining experience without that power, he never comes to rely on it. Help that when Seto finally shows up in Duelist Kingdom, the Blue Eyes user kicked his ass. Seto not acknowledging him due to him literally coming out of nowhere and not earned a right to be there, as opposed to everyone else on the island who was invited and had proven themselves.
As again, Seto's thing is earning and working for your achievements, whereas Jonouchi was just handed a spot in the tournament without doing anything, and the same thing happens in Battle City. That is not conduct he sees as worthy of respecting. The series had a reason for their animosity. This was expunged from the dub.
But that gulf between them proving a more tangible measuring stick which motivates him to not fall into the trap of complacency just because he won when everything said he shouldn't. Mai, for many, became a breakout character of the arc with how she was more than a one-off encountered competitor, but coming in and out of the loop of everyone else, and in a way mimicked Jonouchi's earlier arc in the series of a loner being given a sign of something better she can grasp if she reaches out for it, especially as they then expand on her character as she interacts with them more.
Scenes which were completely scrubbed for the dub because they featured her working as a card dealer at a gambling den.
And their unconditional kindness being something she's seen little of in her life, necessitated by how she's manipulated and used those around her. While she entered the tournament for the money like many, by its end she's made something more valuable than the bauble she first intended to obtain. Something else completely lost in the dub is how Atem more and more shows an arrogant pride as he takes charge and duels opponents for Yugi, getting him into trouble multiple times until Yugi peeks through their duality to think through their situations. As said, pride is his ultimate sin and character flaw, with his confidence in himself clouding his perspective with an assumed superiority and noble cause, and that ultimately comes to a head with his proper rematch with Seto, one demanded by Pegasus, after the man finally has something other than himself to fight for, to rescue his brother from Pegasus' magic and machinations. Everything hinged on him winning here. If need be, Yugi could have hunted down another duelist to get more of the star chips needed to enter the castle, as ends up happening anyways when Mai shows up with spares. But to Seto, who finally reawakened to himself, to be helpless to do anything to help his brother is agonizing, and there's a nobility in wanting to risk all of himself to get him back.
Which the show completely misses when Anzu chews him out for that, despite not knowing his reasons, ironically mirroring the same condemnation she had for others chastising Yugi and Jonochi's goals. Hypocrite Anzu is hypocrite, and it's only made worse in the dub.
Regardless, how Atem defeats Seto is 3 differing levels of bullshit. Multiply does not work that way. Kuribo never worked that way. And Fusion never worked that way to be able to fuse spells and monsters. Coupled with the aforementioned points and the excellent staging of how they peek into Seto's mindset in that moment, it's one of the big humanizing moments for the character, which is lost on Atem as he's all for straight up letting Seto die over something he can get more of. Atem would literally lose nothing by losing to Seto here, and yet what does he do? Go straight for it.
And in doing so, betrays Yugi's trust, as there are only 2 types of stories you can tell that involve body possession. Ones that work as partnerships, and ones that are violations of the self.
As by calling that attack, it would make the kind, gentle boy accessory to murder. Not an act of karma, but because Atem did not want to lose. Thus, Yugi loses all confidence in himself and the spirit, and left almost catatonic, scared of himself and what he could do if he allowed it loose. And despite how the next part of the arc would backhandedly fix it and finally allow expansion on Atem as a character differing from Yugi, there's nonetheless a lingering notion that it could happen again. Nonetheless, the arc closes with Mai repaying the kindness given earlier, and everyone enters Pegasus' castle, prepared to face off in the finals.
Duelist Kingdom only picks up about 10 episodes in.
And by that I mean until Bakura shows up, everything before this is just interim setup for the later story, and doesn't have the energy or investment to things that will result from the following story crafting. When I originally was introduced to the series in 2001, the Bakura duel was the one I came in on, and when I caught the prior episodes, it becomes more noticeable going back how simplistic everything is, and the need to introduce all the gameplay somewhat hurt the story. Then again, a problem with the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Series is its pace, due to it being adapted from a manga, whereas the following series, all being original stories, could script the series events to be set at a more stable pace for the medium.
Next time, however, we'll get more into Pegasus himself, the Millennium Items, the Duelist Kingdom finals, and more things 4K fucked up.